Okay. Welcome. All right. Well, Ryan's question about the chariots and horses and spears and swords and whatnot got me curious. And as some of you know, history is a never-ending adventure for the curious mind. So I started looking into it, and I found really neato stuff about weapons. And I thought, you know what? Let's spend some more time there. It'll be good. Thank you. So, did that. We're going to hit some more weapons today and find out some very, very interesting things. I looked into it and I discovered that while it's true that the Philistines and the Midianites and some of these other enemies had chariots and horses and swords and spears because they were developed civilizations, the Israelites in general didn't. In fact, their weaponry was kind of primitive because, if you remember, they've been wandering around the desert for 40 years. You're not going to carry around a sword if you're walking through the desert all day long, and where are you going to find the metal for it anyway? So some of these other cultures had the monopoly on the metal, which meant Israel didn't have it, which is why sometimes the scripture talks about, for example, Saul and Jonathan being the only ones with swords at some point. At another point it talked about, somebody can make it cooler, all you sweaty boys. At another point it talks about turning your swords into pruning shears and vice versa. So basically, if you only have this much metal, you're going to use it for what you need to use it for. And in peacetime, you need to use it for shearing the grain. But then all of a sudden, if you get called to war, you got to turn that into a sword really quick so that you don't die. Otherwise, the men 20 years and older were the men who were available to be called out, which is why certain times you'll read in the Bible, Gideon did it. When God called him, he sends out the notice to everybody, basically saying, everybody, come to the war because we're going to fight. And so all the people who are 20 years or older men were supposed to come, unless they've been newly married, in which case they got a year off before they went and got themselves killed, which was nice of God. Okay, so what are some of the weapons in the Old Testament? We don't have time to go into great detail, but man, I wanted to hit them because they're super cool. This one for one. Anybody know who that is? Samson. Okay, this is the jawbone of a donkey. And I always thought of it as kind of like, how are you supposed to kill people with that? But when you look at a picture of genuine, it's actually, I believe, still used as a weapon today. It's a good weapon. Grab that thing. It's got a handle. Sometimes they would still have teeth on them. That's formidable. And I also found looking up Samson and the jawbone is a lot like looking up Rebecca in the Old Testament and all the others. You're going to find all these cultural versions of them. Some of them not quite so accurate. Here are a few. We have the Italian Renaissance version, where he's missing most of his clothes. Just so you know, and he's really white, so he's never been outside before without his clothes on. This was a conservative version, just so you know. There were worse ones, more like Cupid versions of Samson out fighting people. Any of y'all who have ever had fake battles outside know it's really good to have your clothes on if you're fighting. So whatever. This is the modern American wrestler version, it seems to be. This is just another one, like whatever. So each culture is going to depict Samson usually in their own idea of what a strong man would look like. So, whatever. All right, another section in Scripture talks about, Sabine, can you read that since you're close enough?
An iron goad or pointed stick for urging an oxen, horse, etc. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, and he too saved Israel, striking down 600 Philistines with an ox-goad.
You'd be like, how are you supposed to get 600 Philistines with an ox-goad? Well, you look at that, that's terrifying. If my dentist pulled that out, I would run out of the room, you know, or somebody's like, we know how to make you talk. I'll be like, yeah, you do. That's painful. And the way they would use those is if you had two oxen yoked together, and they're supposed to be going and doing their thing. Those of you who have worked with animals know that certain animals are a little more stubborn than other animals. And if your ox didn't want to go the way you wanted him to go, you would use your ox-goad to jab him, poke him, and motivate him to go in the direction you would like him to go. And this is referenced in the New Testament, actually, when God is talking to Paul, the apostle. And he talks about, you've been persecuting me, and he says, it's hard for you to kick against the pricks. That's referring to an ox-goad, and basically that God's been after him, and the ox, if he gets really mad, he'll kick and try and kick you to get you to stop, but of course he's too far away. So in other words, God is the one in charge, so you might as well just surrender and let God be in charge, because kicking against the pricks won't do you any good. Interesting. So another guy used that as a weapon. Again, you don't have a sword, but you got this ox-goad, and here come your enemies. What are you going to do? Well, use what you got. I got a bamboo stick. Hopefully my enemies aren't very intimidating. This one fascinated me. Okay, we got the David and his sling, and we often think of that as the one time somebody used a sling to fight a war, but it's not true at all. Okay, the tribe of Benjamin in the book of Judges, they had 700 left-handed slingers who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. That's awesome. Okay, so here we are. We don't have any metal for swords, so you think they're all just completely helpless. Well, they're not stupid. What can we use for weapons? Well, here's a shepherd and he's got a sling, and hey, let's try that because there's plenty of rocks around, right? Easy to make a sling. Next thing you know, and they're all left-handed. Like, that's really interesting. I don't know why that's cool, but if you've ever watched baseball, you know when the pitcher gets up and the pitcher gets up, and all of a sudden the left-handed pitcher gets up, and you're like, ugh. It just sort of glitches, like everything's going to be different. I don't know if that matters or not, but if you imagine you're standing here, here's a valley, you've got a sword. Yeah, I'm so awesome because I have a sword, right? And then you see 700 guys. None of them have swords. Oh, they're all going to die. And they all start whipping out their slings. And they start doing this, all 700 of them. And you know how far a sling can go? I'd be running. I'd be like, my sword is worthless. Like, I could throw it and it wouldn't even get to the end of the room. That's deadly. It's very cool. And if you notice this one over to the right, these guys are right-handed stone slingers. That's from the Lakish reliefs, which we'll get to in a little bit later. But these are, I believe, the Ninevites or the Assyrians. So it's not just the Israelites doing this. This was a form of warfare. Hang on. This was a very formidable thing. There's another one over here in 1 Chronicles talking about archers using both the right and left hands to sling stones and shoot arrows. Again, Benjamites. These Benjamin people, they must have done some serious practicing. So they could sling stones with both hands. I'm so impressed. I think that's so cool. And they could shoot arrows. So again, we're talking distance fighting. That makes sense. If you don't have swords, learn how to fight at a distance, it's much less likely to get you killed. And if I'm in a battle, I'd rather not get killed than get killed. I don't know what to do, but here's another weapon. Now, this wasn't a normal weapon. This was used by a woman. Yeah. She's not a warrior, but they were all being attacked, so they all went into this tower, and they're going to all get killed. It's happened before. You stick everybody in a tower, you burn the tower down, everybody dies, right? Well, the big guy in charge gets close to the wall, and some woman has a millstone. She just chunks it at him, and it hits him on the head and crushes his skull. Boom, we won. So hopefully they sang some songs to her. A millstone, if you don't know what that is, looks like this. And this is a mill. What they would do is to grind the grain, they would put it on here, and the millstone had a stick out to it, and they put an ox or whatever on it, and it would walk around and around and around and around and around, and it would crunch the grain instead of just doing this for the rest of your life. That is what it's referenced in Samson's story, because after they took his eyes out, they put him on the millstone to grind the grain. So that was an extremely humiliating thing to do to the strongest man ever. They were totally humiliating their enemy by doing that. And Jesus mentions the millstone when he talks about the little kids. He says, "It's better that a millstone was tied around your neck and you be thrown into the sea than that you cause one of my little ones to stumble." Jesus cares about kids, and he hates it when people lead them astray. So that's not a sweet thing to say in church all that often. Maybe we should. In the Psalms, David often mentions, "His true shall be thy shield and thy buckler." What's the difference between a shield and a buckler? Well, size, basically. I brought my amazing weapons with me today. Gonna have to use a little imagination. Just wait. The shield and the buckler, why would you need both? Well, a shield is bigger. So, here's my shield. Very protective. So if I've got the stone slingers and the arrow shooters from way far away, I need something that's going to cover my entire body. Because if 700 people shoot an arrow at the same time, it's literally raining arrows. So it's not like you can dodge them. That's not going to happen. You dodge one, you get hit by 7 others. So I need something that I can hide my whole self behind. Now, if somebody shot arrows at me and I hid behind this, it wouldn't work very well. But just imagine this is made out of metal or something. So you got your shield, and remember how precious shields works. They didn't have much metal. So we're not talking about I have a bunch of these and isn't it nice that God's my shield. It's like God is my shield, as in I don't have one. That's cool. Okay? So your shield's big, but if you're trying to wield a sword at the same time. All right. Come here, Aaron. Your name's Aaron, right? What's your name?
Nolan.
I'm sorry, Nolan. Come here. I misspelled you in my head. All right, don't use the real weapon you have because my umbrella will not work against it. All right, so you have a sword and I have a sword and we're gonna fight. Well, I have this shield that's as big as my body and I'm holding it here. How am I gonna fight? Bill, go ahead and try it. Okay, obviously I'm gonna die, right? Because my shield's heavy and it's in the way. So what I need is a buckler. A buckler is a handheld shield. This is not a buckler, this is top of my whisker basket. Okay, the handheld shield is made out of something stronger than this that I can use. Now, go ahead and try and jab me. Jab, ow. Now he cut off my hand, ow. Okay, thank you very much. I give up, I surrender. So my point is, this is for more the hand-to-hand combat fighting, and that is for the distance fighting. So if somebody's throwing, say, a spear or a javelin at me, that's a better idea. Big one's better. And the Romans used to use this, as you can see, that's their turtle formation. They were cool, they were real strategic. You have to be strategic if you want to take over the world and succeed. So they would do this thing where if they were under attack, say from the Vikings, who like to do guerrilla warfare, they'd come out of the forest and they just like, and they just come attack them out of nowhere, which they thought was extremely uncivilized. But hey, it works. The Romans, who were better equipped and had better armor and better weapons, but they were not equipped to fight people jumping out, of the forest for them. So they would pull in, and the people on the outside would put their shields on the outside, and the people in the middle would put their shields up, and they would make this shield for all of them, and it would protect them until the rain of arrows or whatever it was, had stopped, and then they could go kill everybody. But David's saying, "His truth shall be my shield and buckler." It means you're protecting me from the stuff far away, and you're protecting me from the stuff right here. You are my total protection. It's very cool. God told Abraham once, "I am your shield and your exceeding great reward." That's cool. Okay, on to the Babylonian captivity. I don't know if you ever studied this. Super interesting. Unless you're the one who did. Swords out. Alright, this is going to be hard to find. You ready? 2 Chronicles 36, 14 to 16.
2 Chronicles 36.
Go. Okay, stop. Go ahead.
It was 14 through 16, right?
Yep.
All right. And when Judah looked, behold, the battle was in front and behind of it, and they corrected the Lord, and the priests blew the trumpets. Then the men of Judah raised the battle shout, and when the men of Judah shouted, God defeated Jeroboam,
Jeroboam.
and all of Israel before Jerobiah and Judah. The men of Israel fled before Judah, and God gave them into their hand.
That's a very cool passage because, again, we're talking about God winning the victory. Some of you are looking at me very confused because incorrect chapter. But cool passage.
Oh.
Moreover, all the chief of the priests and the people transgressed very much after the abominations of the heathen, and polluted the house of the Lord, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. And the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, and despised his words, and misused his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, till there was no remedy.
Ouch. Remember that cycle we talked about last week? How Israel would sin, they'd start worshiping other gods, and God would send judgment, and it would be bad for them. And however long it took until they finally humbled themselves, eventually they would humble themselves and they would ask for help, and they would repent, and God would send them a judge or a deliverer, and he would deliver his people again. And then once they were delivered and things got easy again and they weren't oppressed, what would they start doing again? Same thing. Over and over again. And we're not talking about they just stopped going to church on Sundays. We're talking about they started worshiping other gods. They started sacrificing their children to the gods. Horrible things that God had nothing to do with and hated. And so here are these people who are called by God's name, and the world's looking at them, and they're doing everything else the world's doing. And so they're totally misrepresenting God, and they're disobeying. One of the things that they did that was disobedient, regardless of whether they were anywhere on this cycle, was that they did not give the land its Sabbath. If you read the Old Testament, there's all these amazing instructions. And okay, imagine if you're reading through it for the first time, you're like, why am I reading all these rules? Like seriously, it's like a rule book. Why is this in the Bible? Why don't we have just the stories? Well, the rules were important. I want you to imagine, 4,000 years ago or whatever, there's no internet, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no books. So medical information, sanitation information on what food is really bad to eat after about a week and a half. Information about if you start getting a sore and it's really fuzzy and it starts eating your arm off, maybe you shouldn't be rubbing up against everybody else. None. Okay? None. If you read the Old Testament, you will find all of those things. Rules about what food is clean and unclean. Rules about quarantining. Basically in 2020 with COVID, we were pretty much following the Old Testament list on things to do for quarantine. Just about exactly. Rules about marriage and family and stuff like that, so you didn't have all these weird inbred diseases and blah, 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 I don't even want to talk about. Rules about stuff that if they obeyed the rules, they literally would be blessed on a practical level. We aren't even talking about spiritual blessings. We're talking about plain old, you don't die as much as other people die. In England, London, in the city, was notorious way back, notorious for their horrible filth and lack of sanitation. Okay, I don't know if you've ever heard about, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, but they had chamber pots, which is your toilet in the middle of the night, there's no such thing, and you use it in the middle of the night, and then in the morning, you dump it out the second-story window onto the street, and whoever happens to be walking by. That's why there's a rule in polite societies that if a man is walking with a woman, the man should walk on the outside closer to the street and let the woman walk on the inside. The reason that's polite is because you might get splattered with somebody's nighttime wee-wee. Thank you. Oh, that's great. Okay, so anyway, the rats come to the city. The rats carry disease. People start getting sick. They don't have sanitation practices, so they start coming up with all these cures, try this, do these weird, creepy things, horrible histories. And they get sicker, and next thing you know, millions of them are dying of the Black Death. Ever heard the ashes, ring around the rosies, pocket full of posies?
Oh yeah,
The posies were flowers that were supposed to block the smell. Ashes, we all fall down. That's from the death thinking. Yeah, the kids were making rhymes about it because it was so bad. Ew. If they read the Old Testament. So there's a reason after the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, we have the Age of Enlightenment when we start thinking about things like let's not throw our poo out in the street on top of people and let's not die of the Black Death. Okay, that's good. I like that. But my point is, we don't think that much of it now because we're following a bunch of this stuff. But if you didn't have any of this information, you read the scriptures, you would live longer. And the whole world would be looking at these people, and even just on a practical level, they'd be like, wow, what is different about you? I think I'd like to be an Israelite too, because everybody over here is dying. I'd rather not die. And spiritual was even on top of that, but it was just plain old, if you obey, you will be blessed. Okay? Well, one of the rules is about the land. And if you've been in farming and stuff, you know that if you farm the land and don't ever let it rest, it strips it of all its nutrients, and your crops fail. God knew this, they didn't know this. So he said every 7th year, don't. Every 7th year, let your land rest. And he would give them what they needed. Just like the manna they weren't supposed to gather any on the 7th day. And what did they do? They gathered on the 7th day and it got worms and grody stuff, and they were like, oops. God said, gather more on the 6th day and I'll protect it. And he did. And the ones who obeyed had stuff to eat on Sunday, and the ones who didn't obey had maggots. Yum. They should know better by now. But they didn't let the land rest either. And you kind of understand that because it's like if God said, you go get a job, and every 7th year, quit your job, and I'll provide for you. That would make most of us a little nervous. We're going to starve to death. We're going to be beggars. We're going to, I don't know what, but I don't want to do it. So they did it. And they didn't, and they didn't, and they didn't. They disobeyed over and over and over and over and over again to the point where 7 times the Sabbaths were not kept. So 7 times. Yeah, how many is that?
49.
Yeah, and then more than that because actually it was 490. For 490 years, Israel never once gave the land its Sabbath. It was just one of the ways that they disobeyed God's commandment. And so, finally, as she was reading, they're worshiping other gods. They're doing this just terrible. And finally God says, enough, I'm going to judge you. And he allowed them to be taken captive. This happened 586 BC. Now remember, the years go backwards because we're leading up to Christ. And now you're going to hear everybody saying BCE because they changed it because they don't want to say before Christ because people are woke and all this stuff. So it's BC, before Christ. That's the original, that's what it's supposed to be. So from 586, this is what happens. And they come in, they attack, it's horrible, I mean, it's just really bad stuff. And they steal a bunch of people. They steal the young people, the best people, the ones that they think, hey, maybe we can use these people in our system. So the young ones, the good-looking ones, the smart ones, the ones we think we can teach the language and train them and all that stuff, steal them, and let's take them out. So Daniel was about 17 years old when this happens. His friend Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were probably around the same time. So you get stolen, you get hiked like 400 miles, probably a bunch of them died on the journey because it's a really long walk, and some people were probably wounded and all that kind of stuff. But the Bible says it's going to last for 70 years. Told them ahead of time this was going to happen. 70 years exactly, so that the land gets its rest. Because for 70 times they didn't let the land rest. So God knows what's happening. This may seem like it's, how could this happen to us? When is it ever going to be over? Well, God told them 70 years. Boom. So anybody who's studying, they know this. Okay, here we go. There it is, right in 2 Chronicles 36:21. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, he was one of God's prophets. And boy, they didn't like him. They threw him in a pit and they were going to kill him and stuff because he told them the truth. Until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. There it is. So they get taken away to this place. Now, the ancient world, we often think of it, like a bunch of people living in tents, with donkeys and stuff. A lot of it was extremely civilized, very sophisticated. You can see the ziggurats in the background, the Babylonian temple. This was a pretty impressive place. The Babylonian gardens are one of the great 7 wonders of the world. It's around Garden of Eden-ish kind of area, and it is present-day Iran. That's important. This actually, some of it was discovered and recovered, so you can recognize it from the picture. That came from archaeology. So it got reassembled, and it's in a museum somewhere. You can go see it if you want. There are walls that go with it that were like miles long in the city. Gorgeous, incredible, wow. But you think about, would you like to be a slave building all this? It's not so incredible anymore. Now, Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, whatever their original names were, all 3 of them, their original names had to do with Yahweh, the God of Israel. When they got there, they were all renamed. Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. All names referencing other gods, the gods of Babylon or things like that. So again, that's on purpose. The intention is to brainwash them and make them rethink and make them incorporated into our culture. They said no. Now, do you think these 4 were the only Jewish people that got brought over?
Nope.
Definitely not. But what's happening here, part of the brainwashing process is, let's get you to like Babylon. Hey, Babylon's way better than where you came from. Look at the food we have. It's good stuff. Look at the drink we have. It's good stuff. We're at a big party here. Look how rich we are. Do you want to be part of this? Sure you do. So they're going to learn the language for 3 years. They're going to be trained for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, they're going to be taken before the king. And the king's going to pick the best ones to be part of his magi. Heard that word before. Well, they start with all this stuff. Now remember the rules about the clean and unclean? Do you you think they were kosher in Babylon? Not so much. So they've got all this stuff that, according to the Jewish religion, is not okay. So at this point, every single Jewish captive has to make a choice. Am I going to go with what I'm doing, what they're telling me to do, because I want to not die? And that's a very valid concern, because they've just trekked about 400 miles after, everybody being killed in their city and all that kind of stuff. Or am I going to say no? Where do you draw the line? Well, they drew it right here from the very beginning. So they tell the guy, they're like, hey, we would like to not eat the king's meat and drink the king's drink, basically. And the guy's like, if you do this, I'm dead, because you're going to look like, little weaklings and stuff, and they're going to ask me why, and I'm going to tell them, and I'm going to get killed. And so Daniel basically says, give us a trial run. Give us, I think it was 10 days. Give us 10 days, and we'll just eat vegetables and whatever. And at the end of 10 days, we'll go with what you say. That was a very wise thing to do. Daniel was a savvy guy. So they go for 10 days. And they said at the end of the days, they looked fatter and better than all the others. Now, that doesn't mean they gained 20 pounds. What it means is they looked healthy. They looked healthy and good. They weren't emaciated, even though they weren't eating all the awesome pork and whatever else they were eating. No hot dogs, just salad. This is not a biblical thing saying you should be a vegetarian. This is a biblical story saying you shouldn't jump into the world's culture and do whatever they're doing, even if it's wrong. Okay. And their wine, you can probably imagine their wine probably wasn't on the grape juice side, Just saying, maybe, I don't know. Okay, so after 3 years, they all get chosen. All 4 of them get chosen to be part of the Magi, the astrologers, the people who are before the king. And that may sound really cool and awesome until the king gets some idea in his head. He's going to chop all your heads off. Whatever. Okay, so he has this dream. Really weirds him out. He's like, bring everybody together. So all of his important people, his super smart people, come in and he says, I have a dream and you need to interpret it for me. And they're like, oh, king, live forever. Tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it is. Now this works out. If he's like, I dreamed that a bird pecked my eyes out, they'd be like, oh, king, something bad's going to happen. He's like, oh, I dreamed I was floating on a river and somebody gave me flowers. Oh, something good's going to happen. It's not real hard. But he's like, I'm not telling you what the dream is. Tell me what it means. And they're like, oh, king, live forever. Nobody can do that. You shouldn't ask that of us. And he's like, I'm going to kill you all if you can't tell me what it is and what it means. And they're like, oh, king. So they actually start sending out the men to start killing them all. Like all of them. He can get new ones. There's plenty of people around. Well, Daniel finds out about this. We're all going to die. Okay, this is a problem. And he says, give me some time. I'll pray about it. I don't know about you, but my prayers would be a little on the desperate side. Lord, we need you some help here. This has never happened before, except since, what's his face? Joseph, goodness. So he prays, and God actually tells him what the dream is. And the amazing thing about this is he goes before the king, and it's super cool, because Daniel could have taken that moment to push himself forward and be top dog. I know what the dream is. All you other people get your heads cut off. Ah. But he doesn't. He basically says nobody can do this. No human on earth can do this, but God can. Joseph did the same thing when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. That's a good idea. If God gives you wisdom, give the credit back to God, because God says if you humble yourself, he'll lift you up. If you lift yourself up, no, not going to work. So he tells him what his dream was. It was this big old statue that had a head of gold, chest of silver, waist of bronze, which interestingly, think of the Olympic medals. Oh, interesting. And then feet of iron, and then, legs of iron and feet that were iron and clay mixed together. This really scares him. And then this big stone that was cut out of a mountain, not with human hands, comes in and crashes against the stone, breaks the whole thing down. And then the stone gets huge and huge and huge and huge. That would be disconcerting. Yeah, I can see where that would concern him. As a king with the most powerful empire in the whole world at this point. Especially if it's a statue of him. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so Daniel explains it to him. And in this prophecy, basically in this explanation, we get a prophecy about the next major world kingdoms that are going to happen in history before they happen. Now that's astonishing. Only God can do that. Daniel could not have done that. I mean, he could have made something up, but he couldn't do this. So we got the head of gold, which is Babylon itself. That's Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. But it's not going to last forever. They never do. The next kingdom coming is the Persian Empire, and we're going to hear about them in a minute, run by a dude named Cyrus, who Isaiah, the prophet, talked about hundreds of years ago by name, saying he is going to be the leader. It's amazing. Then Greece is the bronze in the middle, another powerful empire, but not as powerful as Persia and not as powerful as the gold one on top. Then Rome's coming. Rome is iron. And if Rome was known for anything, it was power. Absolute power. And then we've got the stuff down at the bottom, and that's where it gets a little iffy. It's like, is that us right now? How is that working? And I'll send you a video that explains more about it. But the stone, which the builders rejected, which is now the head's cornerstone, as they said of Jesus, is Jesus. And his rain comes in, blows the other ones out, and then it grows bigger, and it will never end. That's in the scriptures in Daniel. We're going to have to skip on the comments for now, just because we don't have enough time. Sorry. So, after this, he says, wow, Daniel, your God is the King of Kings and God of Gods, and that's amazing. And he makes him like the head dude, pretty much the vice president. Well, what happens when you're in a very competitive environment and suddenly there's a teacher's pet? Is everybody like, oh, yay for you, we're so happy for you?
Good job.
Or are they like, we hate you, and I'm going to try and get you to get kicked out of class so that I can be the head dude? When your whole life sometimes depends on whether you're like up top or not. So Daniel, people are really jealous of him at this point. They don't like him, and this continues on for a very long time. Well, Daniel's prophecy comes true. So Nebuchadnezzar, we'll get there. First, this kills me. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Daniel tells him his dream. He's like, wow, God is the coolest God ever. And then he's like, I'm going to build a statue of myself. Out of gold, like the dream. And everybody has to bow down and worship it. Obviously, he didn't learn much about this whole, like, God is the God of gods and, like, the ruler of everything. Oh, well. So he does this next. It's 90 feet tall. So we're talking a 9-story tall statue. These aren't primitive people. And everybody's supposed to worship it when the musicians do their little musician thing. So he calls all the magicians and the astrologers and all the big wigs, all the important people. Come on. And the music plays. Everybody bows down. And there's probably plenty of Jews in there. But they're like, we don't want to die. I didn't really mean it. And there's these 3 guys standing up. And you got to believe they stood out. Everybody's bowed, and there's 3 of them. Now it's a courageous choice to make. And you know the story. I'm sending a video that's actually a little movie about it. It's very cool, but amazing story. And what I love most about it is, the king's like, I'm going to turn it 7 times hotter. You're going to get killed. Don't you know that I have the power of life or death over you? And they basically said, O king, live forever. Good greeting to a king who kills people. They're like, God has the power to deliver us from you, basically. But even if he doesn't, we're not worshiping your statue. Yeah. It's a man moment. That was cool. And then, of course, God saves them, and he doesn't just rescue them. They're like, who's the 4th one in there? Which is really cool. And then they come out, and guess what he does? Your God is the real God, and he's the one we should all be worshiping. And I make a decree that if anybody who doesn't worship their God, I'm going to chop off your head. That was kind of his thing, I'm going to kill you all if you don't believe this God. So now instead of worshiping me, let's worship God. I don't know how long it lasted. But in the end, the Babylonian Empire was taken over by Cyrus the Great, and Daniel was kept. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I don't think we hear about them after this, so I don't know what happened to them. But he kept Daniel. Now that's really, really interesting, because typically a new president comes in. Does he keep all the people from the old president? No. He tries to get all his own people in there. So very often it was the case that if somebody else came in, you're all dead. He's going to get his own people to come in. So it said something about Daniel that he kept him. By the way, where's the... And then we have Daniel in the lion's den, which again is a whole thing about people being jealous. And by then, Daniel's probably an old man. And I love it that he's still faithful. Daniel never did anything super awesome, ambitious lies. He was just faithful. And he did the right thing, even when it would have been much easier to do the wrong thing. And the cool thing is, the guys who stood up and got thrown in the furnace, nobody wants that to happen to them. But all the ones that bowed down, they missed it, Like, talk about the miracle of your life. They missed it. Computer's done. Bye. Then this happened. 70 years, just like God said. Cyrus the Great, just like Isaiah said. He's like, you know what? I'm going to make a decree. I've got this idea. So cool. The Bible says that God sets up kings and takes down kings. Go ahead. And that he turns the heart of the king as the rivers of water. Don't worry about who's in charge right now of the kingdoms of this world. God's bigger. God's over it. So Cyrus has this idea and he makes this edict. I think everybody should go back to their own lands and worship their own gods and stuff like that. So here are the Jews who've been living there for 70 years, and all of a sudden he's like, you're allowed to go home. Can you imagine? Yeah, okay. And this is well documented in archaeology. In fact, this is the Cyrus cylinder. It is from 538, the Edict of Cyrus, it says so. So it's over 2,000 years old. It was found in 1879. So less than 200 years ago, somebody found this thing. It's like, what do you know? The Bible's true. Go figure. So Isaiah talked about it 150 years before Cyrus. Now Cyrus is doing it, and we don't discover it for about 2,000 years. So just because somebody's like, well, we've never found evidence of this, they used to say that about, Hittites, apparently. Well, the Hittites can't be real because we never found any evidence of Hittites anywhere. The only place it's ever mentioned is in the Bible, and so it can't be real, blah, 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 blah. Well, guess what? The archaeology people discovered an entire Hittite, city. The gates, the city walls, the whole thing leading up to it. Like, wow, these Hittite people were awesome. The Bible was true, So I get a little irritated about that. Okay, so that's Cyrus, and that's his proclamation. And so the Jews are allowed to go home. Well, now, I wanted to mention, Nebuchadnezzar and his big fat statue. It's kind of like, that's, ancient history and super arrogant, and nobody would be so brazen to do something like that today. Well, I just happened today to pull up some video on YouTube that looked interesting. Guinness Book of World Records, like the biggest party in modern history. Turned out to be Iran. 1971, this dude crowned himself the King of Kings, the Shah of Iran, and he had this massive celebration as the 2500th anniversary of the Empire of Cyrus, celebrating Persia's entire history from the beginning to the end. And it's estimated that if you translated the money to today, it would have cost over $100 million. Kings and queens and princes and all these people came from all over the world to go to this party and see this guy crown himself King of Kings. They made this whole village out in the desert, basically, and these houses for people to stay in, and they did stuff on top of them to make them look like the old tents from ancient times, and this was one of them. That was the tent city that they created in the middle of the desert. They brought out 15,000 trees and planted them, and they even brought birds from other countries, but they didn't have enough water for them, so that didn't work out real well. That's the tomb of Cyrus, and the celebration thingy centered around it, and he even made a speech to Cyrus, who is dead. Wow. Their logo was that, the Cyrus cylinder. So it's not such an impossible thing. And can you see this guy kind of being like, hey, if you don't come to my party, you're out? Interesting. They even had this reenactment historical thing where they had this big parade and people were dressed up just like in Bible times, and they had the boats just like the old boats, and it was astonishing. Who knew? Okay, so some of them were allowed to go back. So this is the return from exile. So they're going back on this big long trek, and they go in a couple different routes probably, and God is gathering his people back together. And there's sections in the Bible where it talks about they wept because they got back home and they wanted to rebuild the temple. And the one they rebuilt was this little dinky thing in comparison to the grand, vast, glorious one of before, and it made them really sad. And that's one of the times, I believe that's the time when Nehemiah was like, don't be sad, the joy of the Lord is your strength. It's not about how big your temple is. It's whether God's with you or not. There were 3 phases of the return. I didn't realize this. It's not like they all went back at one time. Now, in the meantime, Esther happens before all this. The king Artaxerxes, also known as Xerxes, and you can see archaeological stuff about him. We just didn't have time. But the first one is about 50,000 people that go back. They're like, yeah, we're ready to go. Let's go. They build the houses. They build the new temple. And then later, Ezra, there's a book, Ezra, in the Bible. Very cool to read, especially in its historical context. So he brings them back, and his is more about spirituality. Ezra purposed in his heart to, I think it's like to read the law of God and to explain it and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments. That was his thing. And then Nehemiah in the video that I'm sending out, I can't even say it the way they do. He goes back with a smaller one, but his thing is we need to rebuild the wall because now they're under attack again. And now his people are vulnerable. And so he lets them go back. And his book is very cool because it talks about with one hand they built the wall and with the other hand they held a weapon. That's very spiritually applicable. Get your work done, but always be prepared. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, first, swords up. You ready? Daniel 1:20.
Daniel 1:20.
Go.
In every matter of wisdom and king's understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom.
Yeah, so that's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego after the 3 years. They come before the king, and the king doesn't just find, I think you're the best among all the people I have. He said they were 10 times better. So these guys, they learned the language, they learned what they were supposed to learn, they kept their commitment to God, and God lifted them up into the highest place. So again, we're not talking about luck. We're talking about God. Obey God, he blesses you. Don't obey God, he might die the black way. Get some actually weaving juice. No thanks.
You know how you were talking about the empire? It could have been Germany.
Yes. There are theories about that last one, and we'll leave them as theories because I don't know. So Daniel and his group are blessed. Other people are blessed. Thank you. If we're missing any, let me know. Now, don't do these yet. Pencil down. Those are for you to do at home because I have some other things to tell you. So set them down for now. Thank you. And life lessons first. Lesson number 1, God is at work even when everything seems wrong. If you were a 17-year-old when all this happened and you got taken away, you would think everything's falling apart. You are a teenager growing up in our culture where a lot of people are saying everything's falling apart and evil is winning and it's so terrible. And how are you supposed to be a Christian at this time? Well, same way they did. Obey God and be faithful. And sometimes that's really hard, and sometimes it means you're going to be the only one standing up when everybody else is on their face, bowing down to the culture. Do it anyway. That's a good lesson. The other lesson, God is more powerful than kings. Like that guy in 1971 that did the whole crown himself king of kings kind of thing, his kingdom didn't last either. It basically sort of kick-started the Iranian Muslim revolution, and yeah, he had to leave. Biggest lesson of all, our kingdom is not of this world. Jesus said that over and over again. His kingdom is not of this world. His kingdom is a heavenly kingdom. So our kingdom, those of us who truly belong to him and are his children, our home's someplace else. So as much as I love America, this is not where I belong.